Today I'm going to be covering the history of a sport that is somehow an amalgamation of dodgeball, rugby, swimming, and it all came together to create an incredibly athletic and skillful sport known as water polo. In this sport, you gotta swim, you gotta catch, you gotta throw, you gotta kick people, you gotta be totally okay with water up your nose and be okay with people basically trying to drown you. So today I'm going to be teaching you the history of water polo. Now, the creation of the sport has about two different versions. One that was played in the United States and one that was created in Scotland that was further developed in Europe to the sport that we know today. So I'm going to start with the American version because it's funnier and because we don't ever use it anymore. In the late 19th century, Americans decided to play polo, because it wasn't already fun enough, on the water. Keeping with tradition, they rode horses in the water. What I mean by horses is a barrel. What I mean on looking like horses is they added a fake head and a tail to the barrels and rode them around, bobbed along the water, and hit a ball with a mallet. Unfortunately, there are no photographs of this event because it kind of predates the camera. However, there are drawings of these events, and there's enough to kind of say that, you know what, it's probably true. Well, it's definitely true. It definitely happened. Essentially, American water polo looked a lot like hobby horsing on water. Granted, they later grew out of riding on barrels and decided swimming was probably a much better way to do the sport. As it got easier to move around on the water because you weren't bobbing on a barrel, the sport got a lot more violent. There was a lot of fights brewing out, kicks, punches being thrown, people half drowning, people getting hypothermia. It was basically just like a free-for-all in the water and hope you survive at the end. Which I know for some people looks a lot like water polo today. However, at least water polo today has rules and like a foul box and stuff. In 1897, the New York Herald Reader formulated the first official rules for the American version of water polo in an effort to reduce the fights and the amount of violence that were in the game, but also to establish a consistency of play throughout the entire country. Now I'm going to go on to the European/Scottish version of the game. Now, European water polo was a little bit different. Again, it has some kind of different origins. However, there's one main one that's kind of credited with being the true version of water polo that we know today. There were a couple different versions of the water polo that we kind of know today that were played in Europe. The first recorded viewing of something similar to water polo is documented as being played at London's Crystal Palace in 1873. There was also a version of water handball that was played in England in 1876. However, William Wilson is credited with being the creator of the sport of water polo that we know today. Wilson was also a journalist and swimming pioneer who helped develop a lot of specific techniques for swimming, as in different techniques for doing different strokes. But before he wrote his 1883 book titled The Swimming Instructor, he created rules for an event called aquatic football in 1877. Unlike the American version, Wilson did not take inspiration from polo, but instead looked towards rugby. At this time was actually just being played in the water for fun. However, Wilson wanted to focus on technical swimming, passing, and being a team. Wilson held the very first official game of this aquatic football in the River Dee in Aberdeen, Scotland, which I will add is very, very cold. After the initial game of aquatic football, the game became more and more popular and spread throughout basically the UK within the next couple of years. During the 1880s, it stressed a lot more on swimming, passing, and technique. The first international water polo match was held in 1890 against England and Scotland, where Scotland would win the game. And the rules that were used for this first international game were the basis for how all international water polo would go from here on out. So America kind of continued to play their version and the UK continued to play theirs. Eventually, Williams' game is picked up by the International Olympic Committee and introduced at the Paris 1900 Games, making it the first ever men's team sport to be played at the Olympics. Great Britain would win the first gold medal and would win again in 1908, 1912, and 1920. I can imagine it was fairly easy to win these gold medals as they were like the only country who played it. They were the country who invented it. So their winning streak, they were quite dominant in the early years of water polo. It was brought on to the 1904 St. Louis, Missouri Games. However, no European nations competed because America demanded that they play by their rules. European nations were like, nah, we got our own rules. So you can guess who won the gold medal for water polo that year. By 1914, however, the USA agreed to adopt the European rules for water polo, which were actually considered the international rules for water polo at this time, and the American version just floated away on a barrel, dressed like a horse, just bobbed away slowly. Once water polo was accepted into the Olympic circuit, it became more popular and widespread internationally. Techniques, rules, regulations, and play styles would continue to develop. So here's a little bit of history of the sport's development and some interesting events that happened. After the UK's 1920s domination of the sport, the domination of the sport was overtaken mostly by Hungary, Italy, the Netherlands, and other Eastern European nations. For kind of the most part are still very important and powerful in the sport today. Other top nations include Greece, Italy, Spain, Croatia, Russia, Montenegro. In a lot of these countries, you can also find professional water polo leagues. At the 1952 Olympics, they were actually going to hold water polo events in the ocean, which didn't go very well because, of course, it's very cold, unpredictable. So kind of after 1952, they decided on creating a kind of set pool and that the game would be played in a pool basically from then on. At the 1956 Melbourne Olympic Games, the sport of water polo became political with the blood and water match, which was a semi-final game between Hungary and the Soviet Union. Now, I've already done a video about this, so if you do want to see it, learn a little bit more about it, you can this card thing will pop up here and you can click on it to learn about it a little bit later. Just a little plug here. Later in 1980, Hungary was dethroned as the reigning, for many, many years, water polo champion. They ended up placing third in that event. They wouldn't get another gold medal back till 2000, so about 20 years later. Now on to women's water polo. As for women's water polo, they didn't start competing internationally until about 1978, even though women had been playing the game locally since the early 1900s, in places like the Netherlands and Australia in particular. At the 1920 Antwerp Olympics, women's water polo was seen for the first time. However, it wasn't an official event, it was only an exhibition game. During the 1970s, women's international water polo grew in popularity. It took some time for the Olympic Games to add it into their roster. And what I mean, it took some time, it took them about 30 years. However, they were able to play it in other international events. In 1981, played it in an event called the World Games, which was basically a way to show what the Olympics were kind of messing up and to trying to be better than the Olympics. There were only 4 teams that took part in this. 2 were from the US, one was from Canada, and 1 was from Australia. Women's water polo would be introduced into the Olympic Games only after it got political. And there are a lot of protests by particularly the women's Australian water polo team. Players such as Carrie Turner and her parents Bill and Pat Jones were leaders in these protests. In April 1997, Pat led a protest rally at the Sydney airport where the FINA, which is the World Aquatics, International Aquatics Organization, its president was arriving. The Australian women's water polo team showed up to protest in their swimsuits, which of course gathered a lot of international attention. Later that year, Australian Olympic Committee President John Coates stated his disappointment that FINA had added another synchronized swimming event, which was the duet, to the Olympic Games, but didn't add women's water polo, which at that time was probably a little bit more popular. In October, when legal action was threatened against the Olympic Committee, they eventually caved and included women's water polo at the next Olympic Games. So at the 2000 Sydney Games, there were 6 female teams, one from Kazakhstan, the Netherlands, Russia, the United States, Canada, and Australia. What makes that story even better is that at these 2000 Olympic Games, which were held in Australia, the Australian woman won the gold medal in a buzzer-beating match against the United States. Anyway, as of right now, Australia is still a really, really competitive women's water polo team. Other teams include the US, again, some kind of Eastern European nations, and Canada are also very good at the sport. So today, Wilson's aquatic football is widely popular in North America, Europe, even South America. It's a highly anticipated and exciting sport that's held during the Olympics and the FINA World Championships every year. It's one of the most competitive and demanding sports basically of all time, and is insanely entertaining to watch. It's also got a cool history. Barrels dressed as horses that are being ridden around by people. I mean, it's some pretty interesting stuff. So thank you for watching this little history on water polo. If you did enjoy it, please like it, give it a thumbs up. Would appreciate that. If you do want to see more history videos, you can always subscribe. And if you have something you'd like me to cover, please leave a comment down below. Thank you for sticking around. Bye. Imagine all the people who showed up for this. So like, hey, do you guys want to wrestle in water? Kind of like play some rugby in water? Pass the ball around, might get hypothermia, you might get a black eye, you might drown, but hey, could be fun. Do you want to, come hang out, see what happens?